Late May sunshine stretched across the Dakota prairie in horizontal bands of gold and amber, the kind of light that made even hard-scrabble homesteads look blessed for an hour or two before dusk. The wagon creaked to a stop on the rutted trail that passed for a road, and Horace Bjornstad squinted at the woman 50 yards distant. She moved between wooden stakes driven into earth at intervals that made no architectural sense, a measuring cord in her hands, lips moving as if calculating something only she could see. His wife leaned forward on the wagon bench. "What in God's name is that widow doing?" The stakes formed a rectangle, that much was clear, but the rectangle didn't extend from her cabin's walls the way an addition should. It stood 6 feet beyond them on all sides, as if she meant to build a second structure around the first, leaving a walking space between. Bjornstad had homesteaded 5 years now, put up 3 barns and a proper 2-room house, and he'd never seen anything like it. Ingrid Solveig Thornquist didn't look up when the wagon rolled past. She pulled the cord taut between 2 stakes, made a mark in the dirt with her boot heel, drove another stake with 3 efficient hammer blows. Her daughter, the eldest one, stood nearby holding more stakes, her face serious in that way children get when they're trying to understand adult mathematics. The younger 2 played near the cabin door, their laughter thin on the wind. "Fool woman's building a barn over her house," Bjornstad muttered. His wife said nothing, but her silence carried judgment enough. They drove on towards their own claim, and Ingrid kept working, and the prairie absorbed the sound of departing wheels like it absorbed everything else, sound and hope, and the bones of those who couldn't adapt. February 14th, 1874. 4 hours before dawn. Temperature 42 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals before it left your mouth. Ingrid's hand found the cabin door latch in absolute darkness, muscle memory guiding fingers too numb to feel wood grain anymore. She pushed the door open 6 inches, and the cold hit her face like a physical blow, but the door didn't open to the outside world. It opened to the space between. She stepped through boots, finding the packed earth floor of the gap, and reached left into blackness. Her fingers touched split pine dry as August bones stacked precisely where she'd placed it in October. She pulled 3 logs free, tucked them against her chest, stepped back through the door into the cabin where her children slept beneath every quilt and blanket they owned. The cast-iron stove still held coals from midnight. She fed it the dry wood and listened to it catch that particular sound of successful combustion that meant survival for another 6 hours. 2 miles south, closer to the creek bottom, a different sound carried on the wind. A man's voice, hoarse and desperate, calling for his wife to bring more blankets. The voice cut off mid-word. The wind filled the silence. Ingrid closed the cabin door and sat by the stove, watching flame shadows play across the ceiling, and thought about the 8 months that had brought her from laughter to vindication, from mockery to this moment where dry wood meant the difference between her children sleeping warm and the sudden silence that had swallowed Niels Bjornstad's voice. September 1872, 15 months earlier. Different world. The cottonwood came down wrong. That was the simple truth of it, the kind of truth that didn't require poetry or explanation or anything except the physics of a 2-ton tree falling 30 degrees off its intended path because a hidden rot pocket shifted the weight distribution at the critical moment. Olaf Thornquist had been clearing land for winter wheat, working the creek bottom where good timber grew thick enough to matter. He'd made the undercut clean, the back cut precise, driven the wedge properly. But the tree pivoted on a rotten core and twisted as it fell, and the heavy limb they called a widowmaker, 40 feet up and thick as a man's thigh, snapped free on impact and came down like judgment. It caught Olaf across the chest and drove him into earth that had been prairie sod 10,000 years before any homesteader thought to plow it. He was conscious when Ingrid reached him, conscious enough to see her face and know what the pressure in his lungs meant. Astrid had run for water, thinking water might help, somehow thinking anything was better than standing still while her father died. Lars and Sigrid were back at the cabin, too young to understand why Mama had dropped the washing and run toward the creek with that look on her face. Olaf's lips moved, but no sound came. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth, bright arterial red against black beard, and Ingrid held his head in her lap and smoothed hair back from his forehead because there was nothing else to do. She didn't tell him it would be all right. She didn't lie. She just held him while his eyes fixed on the cottonwood canopy above them, that particular shade of late summer green that meant abundance and promise, and his chest stopped moving. The funeral was 3 days later. Half the settlement came, maybe 40 people in total, standing in heat that shimmered off the prairie in visible waves. Pastor Nordheim spoke about God's will and eternal rest and the strength required to endure hardship on the frontier. He didn't mention that Olaf's death left a widow with 3 children and 160 acres to prove up in 4 years or lose the claim. He didn't need to. Every person there understood the mathematics of survival. Afterwards, the women circled Ingrid with the careful concern of people approaching a wounded animal. Mrs. Nordheim, the pastor's wife, took her hands. "You should write to your people back east," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "A woman alone with children, it's not possible here, not through a Dakota winter." Ingrid felt the words settle on her like snow, cold and accumulating. She looked past Mrs. Nordheim to where Olaf's grave stood raw and new against the grass, and then to where her children waited by the wagon. Astrid held Lars's hand. Sigrid sat in the wagon bed, 4 years old, swinging her legs and singing something wordless to herself because she didn't yet understand that Papa wasn't coming back. "This is my children's inheritance." The words came out steady, no waver, no doubt. Mrs. Nordheim's face shifted, sympathy hardening into something else. "Inheritance is land you can work," she said, "not land that kills you trying." The men stood separate, talking in the way men do at funerals, voices low and serious. Ingrid caught fragments. Shame about Thornquist. Good man. Knew his timber. Just bad luck. And then quieter widow won't last the winter. Place'll be available come spring. Harlow Cade stood with them, though he wasn't a homesteader. Land speculator, they called him, which was a polite way of saying he made money from other people's failures. He wore a suit despite the heat watch chain glinting when he pulled out his timepiece to check it against the angle of the sun. He looked at Ingrid across the cemetery grass and smiled the kind of smile that meant calculation rather than warmth. Olaf had left firewood. He'd spent August cutting and hauling from the creek bottom, working methodical and careful the way he did everything. 4 cords stacked against the cabin's north wall covered with canvas to shed rain. It looked like a mountain range in miniature, all those split logs organized by size, and when Ingrid looked at it in early October, she felt something like relief. Surely 4 cords would carry them through. Surely that much wood represented safety. The first snow came October 28th. Light dusting, nothing serious, just enough to remind everyone that the plains winter came early and stayed late. Ingrid woke to white prairie stretching in all directions and felt the season's weight settle on her shoulders. She walked to the woodpile and pulled back the canvas. The wood looked exactly as Olaf had left it, each piece in its place, and she carried an armload inside for the cooking fire and tried not to think about the mathematics of consumption versus supply. November brought cold that felt personal, targeted, seeking out every gap in every wall with malicious intent. The cabin Olaf had built was solid by frontier standards, chinked logs, tar paper under the roof boards, real glass in the 2 small windows. But solid by frontier standards still meant gaps wide enough to slide a knife blade through, meant wind that whistled at night like something hunting, meant waking to frost patterns on the inside of the walls. Ingrid fed the stove constantly, cooking, heating, keeping the interior temperature high enough that water in the bucket didn't freeze. She'd grown up in Minnesota, understood cold, but Dakota cold was different. It had patience. It waited. It probed every weakness until it found the way through. Sigrid started coughing the 2nd week of November. Not the normal child cough that came with winter, but something deeper, something that rattled in her chest like loose gravel. Ingrid made poultices from prairie herbs, boiled water to steam the cabin's air, kept the child wrapped in quilts near the stove. The cough persisted, got worse, developed that barking quality that meant croup. At night, when the children finally slept, Ingrid sat by the stove and watched the woodpile shrink. She'd started keeping count on a piece of slate, making a mark every time she brought in an armload. The marks accumulated faster than she'd anticipated. By Thanksgiving, the pile was visibly smaller. By Christmas, it was half gone. Lars, 8 years old and trying to be the man of the house, asked questions with the logic of children who don't yet understand that some problems have no good solutions. Why don't we burn less wood? Mama, can't we just wear more clothes? Ingrid explained about frostbite, about how cold could kill even through layers of wool and cotton, about how Sigrid's cough needed warmth to heal. Lars nodded seriously and went back to his slate where he was practicing letters, and Ingrid added another log to the fire and watched the flames consume it. The problem revealed itself slowly, the way fatal problems often do. The first major snow came December 3rd, 3 feet in one night, and when Ingrid went out the next morning to fetch wood, she found the pile buried. She dug through snow to reach the canvas, pulled it back, and stared at logs covered in ice crystals soaked through with melting snow that had worked its way under the covering despite Olaf's careful arrangement. She carried an armload inside and tried to light it. The wood steamed and smoked and refused to catch. She used precious kindling dried grass and small twigs she'd collected back in autumn and finally got a sullen fire going that produced more smoke than heat. The cabin filled with gray haze. Sigrid's cough worsened. Ingrid opened a window to clear the air and watched her breath cloud in the sudden cold. That night she lay awake and did mathematics in her head. 4 cords total. Half gone, maybe less. 3 months of winter remaining, probably 4 given Dakota's tendency to drag winter into May. The accessible wood was wet and getting wetter with every snow. And wet wood didn't burn, not properly, not enough to keep children warm when the temperature dropped to the 30s below zero that old-timers promised were coming. Christmas morning arrived clear and brutally cold. No gifts this year, nothing except the fact of survival and a meal of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of their molasses. Lars asked if Papa was watching from heaven, if Papa could see them celebrating Christmas. Ingrid said yes, knowing it might be a lie but needing it to be true. Astrid, 10 years old and understanding more than anyone wanted her to, pulled Ingrid aside after the boys were asleep. "Mama," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are we going to die?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Ingrid could have offered false comfort, could have promised everything would be fine, could have done what adults do when children ask unanswerable questions. Instead, she looked at her daughter's serious face and chose truth. "I don't know, Elskling, but I promise I will do everything I can to keep us alive." Astrid nodded, accepting this, and went to bed with her siblings, 3 children under a mountain of quilts, their breathing visible in the dim light from the dying fire. January 1873 arrived with temperatures that made November look mild. The thermometer by the door, one of the few luxuries Olaf had insisted on, showed 30 below zero on January 12th, 35 below on the 15th. The wind never stopped pushing through every crack, stealing warmth faster than the stove could replace it. The woodpile was 3/4 gone. The accessible logs were frozen solid, ice-encrusted, effectively useless. Ingrid tried everything. She brought logs inside to dry by the fire, but that meant sacrificing current heat to maybe generate future heat, and the exchange rate was terrible. She used the axe to split frozen logs into smaller pieces, thinking surface area might help them catch, but frozen wood didn't split cleanly, and the effort left her exhausted, and the results were negligible. On January 18th, with the temperature at 38 below and Sigrid coughing blood-flecked phlegm, Ingrid looked at the furniture Olaf had built. A table, 6 chairs, 2 benches, all handmade from creek-bottom oak, all solid and beautiful and entirely flammable. She looked at Astrid and saw understanding in the girl's eyes. "I'm sorry," Ingrid said, not sure if she was apologizing to her daughter or her dead husband or the universe that had brought them to this moment. She picked up the axe and reduced the first chair to kindling. It burned clean and hot dry oak that had spent 3 years inside the cabin, and for 6 hours the temperature rose to something almost comfortable. Sigrid's coughing eased. Lars and Astrid sat close to the stove and didn't say anything about the missing chair. That night they ate hot food for the first time in a week, and Ingrid burned 2 more chair legs to keep the fire going through the dark hours and tried not to think about the mathematics of furniture versus winter. By February she'd burned 5 chairs and started on the table legs. By early March, she was prying up floorboards, the sound of nails shrieking free from joists like something being tortured. The cabin developed gaps in the floor where cold rose through like groundwater seeping into a failing boat. The children slept together in one bed, Astrid in the middle with Lars and Sigrid pressed against her for warmth, and Ingrid sat by the stove and fed it pieces of their home and waited for spring. March 15th, a neighbor came riding through what passed for a road, snow still 3 feet deep in the drifts but packed hard enough to support a horse. He stopped at each homestead to share news, the verbal telegraph that kept isolated families connected. The Lindgrens were dead, he said, both of them found in their cabin when the thaw started. Just froze. Ran out of firewood sometime in February, looked like. The McTavish family had lost 2 children, the youngest ones who'd been sick anyway, but the cold finished what illness started. 3 other families had abandoned their claims and headed back east if they made it, if they didn't freeze on the journey. Ingrid thanked him for the information and gave him hot coffee from the pot she kept on the stove, and after he left she sat down on the floor because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. Astrid found her there and sat beside her, saying nothing, just being present the way children do when they understand that silence is sometimes the only appropriate response. When spring finally came for real, when the snow melted and revealed the prairie grass beneath, brown and matted but alive, Ingrid walked through her damaged cabin and took inventory. 7 pieces of furniture destroyed, 23 floorboards gone, leaving gaps that would need replacing before next winter. The woodpile completely exhausted, not a single log remaining. They had survived but barely, and the cost of survival was written in the cabin's wounds. She walked outside and looked at the structure Olaf had built and thought about the Lindgrens frozen in their cabin 2 miles south, and the McTavish children buried in graves that were still too frozen to dig properly. She thought about winter coming again in 7 months, about wet wood and buried wood piles, and the terrible mathematics of consumption versus supply. And then she thought about Minnesota 15 years earlier, when she'd been a girl visiting the Anderson farm with her mother. She remembered their barn, the way it connected directly to their house through a covered passage. She remembered stepping from the warm kitchen into the barn space and feeling the heat from the animals, the way everything they needed for winter was stored under that one continuous roof. Hay grain, tools, firewood, all of it dry, all of it accessible, all of it protected from the snow that buried separate structures and made survival a daily gamble against weather. The memory crystallized into something like a plan. Not complete yet, not fully formed, but enough of a shape that she could see the outline. She went inside and found a piece of charcoal from the stove and the smoothest floorboard that remained, and she started to draw. Astrid woke sometime after midnight and found her mother sitting by lamplight sketching lines and making calculations on the wood. "Mama, what are you drawing?" Ingrid looked up at her daughter. This serious child who'd held her siblings through the worst winter any of them would hopefully ever see, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something in hope's neighborhood. Our future, Elskling. I'm drawing our future. April brought the kind of weather that made homesteading seem possible again. Warm days, cold nights, the prairie turning green in that sudden Dakota way where winter's brown death became spring's abundance in what felt like a week. Ingrid spent the month repairing the cabin's immediate damage, replacing floorboards with rough-cut pine she bought on credit from the sawmill in town, chinkling the gaps that winter had opened, making the space livable again. But her mind was on the larger plan, the drawing she'd made and refined through March, the structure she could see now with absolute clarity, even though it existed only on paper and in her imagination. A barn built over and around the existing cabin, using the cabin as the core of a larger design. Sod walls on the outside, thick and insulating, creating a 6-foot gap between cabin walls and barn walls. That gap would store everything they needed, protected from weather, accessible regardless of snow depth, dry through the wettest autumn and coldest winter. She knew how it would sound to other people. Crazy, wasteful, a woman trying to do work she didn't understand. But she also knew with the certainty that came from watching her children nearly freeze while she burned their furniture, that conventional solutions led to conventional failures. The families who died or abandoned their claims had done everything the normal way. And the normal way in Dakota winters killed you. The first person she told was Pastor Nordheim, not because she needed his permission, but because he was the closest thing to community authority the settlement had, and she wanted to hear his objections now rather than mid-construction. She rode into town on a Saturday in early May, brought the children because leaving them alone still felt dangerous even with winter past, and found the pastor at the church working on his Sunday sermon. He listened to her explanation with the patient expression of a man accustomed to hearing confessions and proposals he had no power to grant or deny. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her across the small desk. "Mrs. Thornquist," he said, "I understand you've had a difficult winter. We all have. But this plan of yours building a barn over your house, it's not sensible. It's not how things are done." "I know it's unusual," Ingrid said. "That's why I'm certain it will work." The pastor frowned. "You're a woman alone with 3 children. The physical labor alone would be beyond your capability. And even if you could build it, the expense, the materials, the time. You should be focused on finding a husband, someone to help provide for your family." Ingrid kept her face neutral, her voice even. "I appreciate your concern, Pastor, but I've made my decision. I wanted to inform you, not ask permission." She stood, gathered her children, and walked back to the wagon. Behind her she could feel the pastor's disapproval like heat from a fire, but disapproval couldn't freeze her children, and approval couldn't keep them warm. She'd learned that much at least. The settlement's reaction was swift and predictable. By the time she started marking out the foundation in late May, driving stakes in that peculiar pattern 6 feet from the cabin's walls, the gossip had spread through the scattered homesteads like fire through dry grass. Women whispered about grief breaking her judgment. Men made jokes about the widow's folly about a woman trying to do a man's work and doing it backward. Horace Bjornstad stopped his wagon to watch her work, his wife beside him. "What exactly are you building, Mrs. Thornquist?" "A barn," Ingrid said, not looking up from the measuring cord she was pulling taut. "Around your house?" "Yes." Bjornstad laughed, not meanly but with genuine amusement. "Well, I've seen some strange things on this frontier, but that might be the strangest. You know, a barn goes beside a house, not over it." Ingrid drove another stake, her hammer blows precise and final. "I know how things are usually done, Mr. Bjornstad. I'm choosing to do them differently." The wagon rolled on, and behind it came others, neighbors drawn by curiosity or concern or the simple human need to witness something unusual. They all had opinions. They all had advice. They were all certain she was making a mistake born of ignorance or grief or the particular madness that frontier isolation could breed in weak minds. None of them had spent January burning their furniture while their youngest child coughed blood. The one person who didn't laugh was an old man Ingrid had never seen before. He appeared one morning in mid-May, walking up the trail from the creek bottom, moving with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to conserve energy in a landscape that punished waste. He was perhaps 60, maybe older, with the kind of weathered face that made exact age impossible to determine. He stopped 20 feet from where Ingrid was working and watched her drive stakes for maybe 10 minutes before speaking. "You're building Norwegian style," he said. His accent placed him as Scandinavian, probably second generation, the English perfect, but carrying that particular rhythm. Ingrid straightened. "You've seen this before? Built 3 of them myself back in Minnesota. Lost them all, but that was my fault, not the designs." The old man stepped closer, looking at the stake pattern with professional interest. "Barn over house, sod walls. Storage gap between. It works if you do it right." Ingrid felt something in her chest loosen some tension she hadn't known she was carrying. "Will you teach me?" The man studied her face for a long moment, and Ingrid had the sense he was seeing past the surface, looking for something specific. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him. "My name is Gunnar Eriksson. I'll help you build it if you'll accept help from a stranger." "Why would you help me?" "Because I failed to build it right when it mattered, and good people died because of my failure. Helping you is the closest I'll get to making that right." Ingrid extended her hand, and they shook formal and binding. "Then let's begin." The next 3 months were work of a kind Ingrid had never experienced, labor that was physical and mental and spiritual all at once. Gunnar proved to be a teacher of the old-school patient, but exacting, willing to explain the why behind every technique, but intolerant of shortcuts or sloppy execution. They started with sod cutting, and here Ingrid learned her first major lesson about prairie construction. The grass that looked so delicate above ground had roots that went down 3, 4, sometimes 5 feet, a dense network that held the soil together like woven fabric. Cut it right in blocks 3 feet long and 1 foot wide, and you had building material that would last decades and insulate better than any timber wall. Cut it wrong, and you had dirt that crumbled to nothing. Astrid helped with the cutting, learning to use the sod cutter with the same serious intensity she brought to everything. Lars, eager to prove himself useful, worked the handcart hauling cut sod from the prairie to the building site. Even Sigrid contributed, collecting wildflowers from the prairie and pressing them between the pages of their mother's Bible, a child's task that let her feel included in the larger work. The actual construction began in early June. Gunnar showed Ingrid how to lay sod bricks in overlapping courses, each layer perpendicular to the one below, creating a wall that was strong and stable and more than 2 feet thick. The thickness mattered, he explained, not just for insulation but for structural integrity. Sod walls could carry tremendous weight if built properly, could support a roof that would shed snow and last for years. They worked from dawn to dusk, and some days past dusk when the light held long enough to place another course. Ingrid's hands developed calluses on the calluses, her back ached in ways she'd never experienced, but the walls rose steady and true, and watching them grow felt like watching the future take solid form. In late June, Harlow Cade appeared on horseback, his suit somehow spotless despite the prairie dust. He sat watching them work for perhaps 5 minutes before speaking. Thornquist, I've been reviewing the Homestead records. You're required to show substantial improvement to the claim by October to maintain your rights. I'm not sure this, he gestured at the half-built walls, qualifies as improvement. Looks more like vandalism to me. Ingrid set down the sod brick she'd been positioning and walked to where Cade sat his horse. The building will be completed by October, she said. It will demonstrate substantial improvement well beyond the legal requirement. Cade smiled his calculating smile. We'll see. I've got 3 buyers interested in this parcel. Good creek access, decent timber. If you fail to prove up, the land goes to auction, and I'll make sure it finds a proper owner. He rode away, and Gunnar came to stand beside Ingrid. That man's trouble. I know. But the law is clear. Substantial improvement to the claim within 5 years. This barn cabin will stand as proof that I've improved the land. If you finish it, Gunnar said, and if you live long enough to see October. The words hung in the summer air, ominous, and then Gunnar picked up his tools and went back to work, and Ingrid did the same because work was the only answer to words like that. July brought heat that made the early summer seem mild, and with the heat came mosquitoes in clouds so thick they looked like smoke. Working became a battle against insects and sun and the constant physical demands of lifting, placing, leveling, checking. Gunnar taught Ingrid to read the walls to see when a section was settling wrong, to understand how sod would behave as it dried and compressed. They finished the walls by the end of July, 4 walls of prairie earth standing strong and true, enclosing the cabin in a larger structure with that critical 6-foot gap between cabin walls and barn walls. The space looked enormous when empty, and Ingrid tried to imagine it filled with firewood, with supplies, with everything they'd need to survive the winter. The roof was harder. Timber was expensive and had to be hauled from town 15 miles over prairie that turned to mud whenever it rained. Ingrid had saved money through the spring selling eggs and butter to other homesteaders, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. She rode to the sawmill in early August and spoke to the owner, a practical man named Johansson, who had no particular love for land speculators like Cade. I need lumber for a barn roof, she said. I can't pay cash, but I can trade labor. What kind of labor? Johansson walked her through the mill yard, explaining what needed doing. Logs needed debarking boards, needed stacking sawdust, needed sweeping and hauling. 2 weeks of work, he estimated, maybe 3. That would buy her the lumber she needed. I'll do it, Ingrid said. Starting tomorrow. What about your barn? Johansson asked. Gunnar can continue laying the framework. I'll work here during the day and on the barn at night. Johansen studied her face the way Gunnar had studied it months before. "All right, Mrs. Thornquist, we have a deal." The next 3 weeks were the hardest of her life, harder even than January's cold because they required sustained effort rather than desperate survival. She woke before dawn, rode to the mill, worked 10 hours, doing labor meant for men, rode home and worked another 3 hours on the roof framework by lamplight and moonlight. Astrid helped when she could, holding tools, passing materials, but mostly trying to keep Lars and Sigrid occupied so their mother could focus. On the 14th day, working in the mill yard, moving green lumber from the stacking area to the drying shed, Astrid lifted from the wrong angle, and a board shifted. Not much, 6 inches maybe, but enough that the stack above it lost balance. Lars, standing too close and trying to help, didn't see it coming until the board was already falling. It caught his left hand against the stack edge, the full weight of green oak, easily 200 pounds, concentrated in the width of a board edge. The sound was immediately wrong, bone and flesh compressed between hardwood surfaces, and Lars screamed a child's scream of pain and shock that brought every worker in the yard running. Johansen pulled the board free and Lars's hand came with it. 3 fingers crushed the pinky, bent at an angle. Fingers shouldn't bend, blood welling from splits in the skin where pressure had exceeded flesh's capacity to hold together. Ingrid scooped her son up and ran for the wagon, knowing the nearest doctor was 40 miles away, knowing that 40 miles might as well be 4,000 when you had a child with a crushed hand, and the afternoon was already half gone. She made it 10 miles before the reality settled in. She couldn't reach the doctor before nightfall, couldn't navigate prairie trails in darkness with an injured child, couldn't risk getting lost and having Lars bleed out or go into shock in the middle of nowhere. She turned the wagon around and drove for home, where Gunnar was waiting with the kind of folk medicine learned from necessity and desperation. He examined the hand by lamplight while Lars whimpered and Astrid held her brother's other hand and Sigrid hid in the corner crying. "The middle 3 fingers might be saved," Gunnar said, "but the pinky's broken in at least 2 places. Crushed, really. It won't heal right. What do we do?" Ingrid heard her voice asking from somewhere far away. "Clean it, bind it, hope infection doesn't set in, and pray." Gunnar looked at her directly. "If infection starts, we'll have to take the finger, maybe the whole hand." "You understand?" Ingrid understood. She understood that frontier medicine was brutal and imprecise, and that children died from injuries that would be minor inconveniences in places where doctors lived within shouting distance. She understood that her decision to build the barn to trade labor for lumber had put Lars in the mill yard where boards fell and hands got crushed. They cleaned the wounds with whiskey, bound the hand with strips torn from the last clean sheet, and gave Lars enough laudanum to let him sleep. Gunnar stayed through the night, keeping watch, checking for fever, teaching Ingrid the signs of infection to watch for. 3 days later, Lars's hand had swollen to twice its normal size, hot and red and tender. The pinky had turned colors that flesh shouldn't be, purple and black, and a sick yellow-green that smelled wrong. Gunnar prepared his knife, and Ingrid held her son down while the old Scandinavian removed half of Lars's left pinky finger, cutting through bone that had shattered beyond healing, cauterizing the wound with a heated blade, binding it again with whiskey-soaked cloth. Lars screamed himself unconscious, and Astrid threw up in the corner, and Sigrid ran outside and refused to come back for hours. But the infection stopped spreading, and after a week Lars started healing, and after 2 weeks he could move his remaining fingers without crying. He never complained. 8 years old with half a finger gone, and he just adapted. Learned to do everything one-handed or with 9 fingers instead of 10. And when Ingrid tried to apologize, he looked at her with Olaf's serious expression and said he was fine, Mama. It was just a finger. They had a barn to finish. They did have a barn to finish. The roof lumber had been paid for, delivered while Lars healed, and now it waited in stacks beside the structure for assembly. Gunnar taught Ingrid to frame the roof properly, to understand how weight would distribute, how snow loads would stress the timbers, how to build overhangs that would protect the sod walls from rain and shed snow away from the foundation. They worked through September, racing against the calendar and the prophecies of early winter that old-timers muttered about when they thought no one was listening. By the last week of September, the roof was complete solid timbers covered with tar paper and cedar shingles sloping at angles that would make snow slide free rather than accumulate. Ingrid stood back and looked at what they'd built. From the outside, it looked like a large sod barn. Nothing unusual except perhaps the careful craftsmanship, the way the walls stood plumb and true, the roof symmetrical and well-proportioned. But inside was the cabin protected now within a larger structure, and between cabin walls and barn walls was that critical 6-foot gap, and in that gap they would stack everything they needed to survive the winter that was already sending its first scouts south from Canada. On October 5th, Harlow Cade rode out to the homestead again, this time with a man from the land office, a bureaucrat with wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook where he recorded improvements for the government records. They walked around the structure, examined the construction, asked questions about square footage and materials and intended use. The inspector walked through the gap space, touching the sod walls, checking the roof framework visible from inside. "I've never seen anything quite like this," he said. "It's not a traditional barn, but it's certainly a substantial structure. Well built, too." Cade's face showed his disappointment clearly. "Surely this doesn't qualify as proper improvement. It's neither a house nor a barn. It's some kind of mongrel design." The inspector made notes in his book. The Homestead Act requires substantial improvement demonstrating intent to cultivate and reside on the claim. This structure clearly demonstrates both. It houses the family and provides storage for agricultural supplies. Claim approved. Cade opened his mouth to object, and the inspector cut him off. "Mr. Cade, unless you have legal grounds to contest this determination, my ruling stands. Mrs. Thornquist has met the requirements." They rode away. Cade stiff with anger, the inspector satisfied with bureaucratic duty completed. Ingrid watched them go and felt something like triumph, small and precious and hard-won. She owned her land now legally and finally. No one could take it from her based on questions of improvement or capability. But owning the land and surviving on it were different challenges, and winter was coming fast. The first snow fell October 10th, light and melting quickly, but carrying winter's warning in every flake. Ingrid looked at her children and at Gunnar and at the empty gap space waiting to be filled. "Time to gather firewood," she said. "We have 5 weeks, maybe 6. We need 6 cords to be safe." They started cutting the next day. The creek bottom timber had been picked over by every homesteader within 10 miles, but Gunnar knew where to look. He led Ingrid and Astrid past the obvious groves to a bend in the creek where cottonwoods grew dense and tall, protected from prairie fires by the water's curve, old enough that their wood had seasoned in standing. Death killed by some flood years back, but still vertical, still dry at the core where good burning wood waited. "This is what you want," Gunnar said, running his hand along bark that came away in chunks. "Dead 3 years, maybe 4, dry all the way through. Cut it now. Stack it right, it'll burn clean all winter." They felled the first tree together, Astrid pulling the crosscut saw opposite her mother, learning the rhythm that made the blade bite efficiently rather than bind. Lars worked one-handed, dragging branches clear, stacking them for later processing into kindling. Even Sigrid helped gathering the smallest twigs into bundles, her child's hands efficient at tasks scaled to her capability. The wagon could carry maybe a quarter cord per trip, which meant 40 trips to reach their target of 6 cords. 40 trips of cutting, loading, hauling 15 miles over prairie that was already freezing at night, unloading, stacking. Gunnar calculated they had 5 weeks before heavy snow made the creek bottom inaccessible. 5 weeks to complete work that should take 8. They started before dawn and worked past dusk, and the first week taught Ingrid muscles she didn't know she possessed could hurt in ways she'd never imagined. Her hands blistered, healed, blistered again. Astrid developed calluses that made her palms look like leather. Lars learned to compensate for his missing finger. Half became more efficient with 9 digits than most people managed with 10. Gunnar taught them the Norwegian stacking method, arranging split logs in alternating layers with air gaps between, creating structures that looked like solid walls but allowed circulation that prevented rot and kept the wood dry from the inside out. Each piece had to be placed deliberately, thinking about weight distribution, about how settling would compress the stack over winter, about accessibility when snow made visibility impossible. The gap space between cabin and barn walls transformed as they filled it. What had been empty air became corridors of stacked timber organized by wood type, and sized the largest logs on the bottom kindling in designated sections. Everything arranged so Ingrid could navigate by touch in absolute darkness and still find exactly what she needed. By the end of October, they'd cut and hauled 4 cords, and Ingrid's body had adapted to the work in that way human bodies do when survival requires it. She could swing the axe for hours without her grip failing, could lift loads that would have been impossible in September, could read the grain of wood and know where to strike for the cleanest split. The mockery from the settlement had shifted in tone. People still thought she was strange, still questioned her judgment, but the completed barn cabin stood as evidence of something, and the systematic firewood operation demonstrated a level of planning that even skeptics couldn't entirely dismiss. The jokes became quieter, more uncertain, as if the tellers weren't quite sure anymore whether they were laughing at foolishness or something they didn't yet understand. Mrs. Bjornstad came by one afternoon in late October, ostensibly to borrow yeast, but really to see the structure from inside. Ingrid showed her through the gap space, let her see the stacked cords, the organization, the careful craftsmanship. "It's very neat," Mrs. Bjornstad said, running her hand along the sod wall's interior surface. "But all this work for firewood seems like you could just stack it outside like everyone else." Ingrid thought about January of the previous year, about digging through snow to reach wet logs, about smoke filling the cabin, about Sigrid coughing blood. She could have explained all of that, could have laid out the logic and the desperation that had birthed this design. Instead, she smiled and offered tea, and after Mrs. Bjornstad left, she went back to stacking wood because actions would prove or disprove her choices more effectively than any argument. Gunnar worked alongside them through October, and as the month wore toward November, Ingrid noticed him growing quieter, more contemplative, as if making calculations about something beyond timber and weather. One evening after they'd unloaded the day's haul, and Astrid had taken the younger children inside for supper, he sat on the wagon bed and looked at the barn cabin in the fading light. "I'll be leaving soon," he said, "before the first real snow." Ingrid felt the words like a physical blow, surprising in their impact. She'd known Gunnar less than 6 months, but he'd become essential to the work in ways that went beyond labor. His knowledge, his calm certainty, his ability to see problems before they materialized. "Why?" "Because I've taught you everything I know, and what you do with it now is your story, not mine." Gunnar pulled a piece of jerky from his pocket, chewed it slowly. "And because there's another family 2 days' ride west struggling with their first winter. Man there doesn't know what he doesn't know, and his wife's pregnant, and they'll both be dead by February if someone doesn't show them how to survive." The choice between staying where he was valued and helping strangers who might not listen wasn't really a choice, Ingrid realized. It was who Gunnar was, this itinerant teacher of survival, moving from crisis to crisis, teaching what he'd learned from his own failures. "Will you come back?" Her voice held more hope than she'd intended. Gunnar stood dusted bark fragments from his trousers. "If the winter's kind, maybe. If not," he shrugged. "Then you'll remember what I taught you and teach it to someone else when they need it. That's how knowledge survives out here, Mrs. Thornquist. We pass it along person to person, failure to success to failure again, until eventually enough people know enough to change the odds." He left 3 days later on a morning when frost made the prairie grass look like it had been dipped in silver. Ingrid gave him dried venison and cornmeal supplies he refused until she insisted, and he gave her a small leather-bound notebook filled with diagrams and measurements, annotations in Norwegian and English, explaining principles of construction she might need someday. "Take care of those children," he said, shaking her hand with the formality of significant goodbyes. "They're learning things most adults never figure out." She watched him walk west until he disappeared into the prairie's vastness, and then she turned back to the work, because they still had 2 cords to cut, and winter was coming fast. The 5th cord filled by November 7th. They started the 6th on November 8th, working with an urgency driven by weather signs that needed no interpretation. The cottonwood's leaves had dropped early. Geese passed overhead in formations so large they darkened the sky. The light had that particular quality it got before major snow. a strange clarity that made distances seem compressed. They finished cutting the 6th cord on November 12th, stacked the last of it on November 14th, and Ingrid stood in the gap space surrounded by enough firewood to last 2 winters and felt something she hadn't felt in 16 months. Not quite safety, because the plains taught you that safety was an illusion, but a kind of provisional security, the knowledge that at least one major variable in the survival equation had been solved. Astrid found her there, standing among the stacked timber in the late afternoon light that filtered through gaps in the barn walls. "Mama, we did it. We did." Ingrid pulled her daughter close, this serious child who'd learned to use a crosscut saw and calculate board feet and understand that survival required planning seasons in advance. "You were essential to this Elskling. I couldn't have done it without you." "What about Lars and Sigrid? Did they help too?" "Everyone helped. But you understood why we were doing it." "That's different." The first snow came November 16th, light flurries that accumulated to maybe 2 inches, nothing serious but carrying winter's announcement. Ingrid tested the system that evening, opening the cabin door after dark, stepping into the gap space where blackness was absolute, reaching left and finding split pine exactly where she'd stacked it. She carried 3 logs back into the cabin and fed them to the stove and listened to them catch dry wood, igniting immediately, burning clean and hot. Lars watched her from his bed, his bandaged hand resting on the quilt. "Is this the winter, Mama? The one that shows if it works?" "This is the winter," Ingrid confirmed, "but we're ready for it." November stayed relatively mild temperatures in the teens and 20s, snow light and intermittent. The homesteaders went about their business, cutting their own firewood when weather permitted, making final preparations, salting meat and storing root vegetables, and doing all the small tasks that accumulated into winter readiness. Ingrid used the time to teach her children things they'd need to know. Astrid was already literate, but Ingrid pushed her into more advanced mathematics, teaching her to calculate volumes and ratios, to understand compound interest and land measurements, practical knowledge that would serve her whether she stayed on the prairie or eventually left it. Lars struggled with reading the letters reversing themselves in ways that frustrated him, but he had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that amazed Ingrid. She'd watch him study the stove's damper mechanism or the door's hinge arrangement and see him understanding not just what the parts did, but why they worked together, as if he could see the invisible forces that made simple machines function. Sigrid was only 6, but she had a memory for songs and stories that bordered on uncanny. She could hear something once and recite it back perfectly, and Ingrid started teaching her the old Norwegian folk tales, the ones with lessons embedded in narrative, the ones that taught children about consequences and wisdom without lecturing. The evenings took on a pattern. Supper cleaned up efficiently with everyone helping. Then an hour of education, each child working on their strengths, while Ingrid moved between them, teaching, correcting, encouraging. Then a story often told rather than read, Ingrid's voice carrying the rhythm of old Norway her mother had passed to her. Then bed the 3 children together under their shared quilts, and Ingrid by the stove with mending or planning, or just the quiet contemplation of a day successfully survived. December arrived with a temperature drop that felt like falling through ice. The thermometer showed -15 on December 3rd, -22 on the 4th. The wind came from the north, carrying the kind of cold that made your teeth ache, that found every microscopic gap in every wall and probed it like a surgeon looking for weakness. But inside the cabin, protected by the outer barn walls and the insulating air gap filled with firewood, the temperature stayed comfortable. The sod walls held heat with an efficiency that amazed Ingrid every time she checked. The gap space itself stayed above freezing the wood mass, acting as thermal ballast. The air circulation preventing condensation that would have soaked the timber. She could hear the wind howling outside, could feel the whole structure shudder when gusts hit hard, but inside was warmth and light and the sound of children doing ordinary things. Lars carving a toy horse from scrap wood, Sigrid singing to herself, Astrid reading from their mother's Bible by lamplight. On December 15th, the blizzard Gunnar had predicted, the one the old-timers had whispered about. All fall arrived with the sudden violence of an ambush. Ingrid woke at 3 in the morning to a sound like artillery wind hitting the barn walls with enough force to make the timbers creak. She lit a lamp and checked the children, all three still sleeping. Somehow then wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened the cabin door. The gap space was dark, but not silent. She could hear the wind roaring overhead, could feel the barn walls shuddering under the assault, but the interior space remained still, protected, the stacked firewood absorbing vibration and sound. She selected 4 large logs, enough to keep the stove fed until morning, and went back inside. By dawn, the blizzard had erased the world beyond the barn walls. Visibility outside was 0. Just white chaos in every direction, snow coming horizontal, the wind pushing it with enough force to sandblast exposed wood. The temperature dropped to -35, and according to what Bjornstad had told her, the wind chill made it effectively 60 below. The children woke to breakfast, as usual, cornmeal porridge with dried apples hot enough to warm hands and bellies. Astrid looked out the window at the white maelstrom, and then at her mother. "Are the neighbors all right?" "I don't know," Ingrid said honestly, "but there's nothing we can do for them until this passes." The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that never stopped, snow that accumulated in drifts measured in feet rather than inches. Temperatures that made the previous December's cold seem almost balmy. Ingrid maintained their routine, kept the stove fed with dry wood she could access in darkness, kept the children occupied with lessons and stories and small tasks that gave shape to days when the outside world had become uninhabitable. On the second day, Astrid asked the question that had been waiting to be asked. "Mama, how are other families managing? The ones who don't have barn cabins?" Ingrid thought about wet wood and buried wood piles, about the Lindgrens who'd frozen the previous winter, about the choices people made when desperation overrode judgment. They're managing however they can. Some have enough dry wood stored inside, some are burning furniture, some are praying. Will people die? The question deserved honesty, even when honesty was harsh. Probably Elskling. Winter out here kills people. That's why we prepared. When the blizzard finally broke on December 18th, the prairie had been transformed. Drifts buried structures to their rooflines, the landscape sculpted into waves and valleys of white that bore no relationship to the flat grassland underneath. The temperature had dropped to -42 overnight, cold enough that breath froze in the air between mouth and ground. Ingrid opened the barn door and looked out at a world remade. The nearest visible landmark was Bjornstad's cabin, maybe 200 yards distant, and she could see smoke rising from his chimney. Thin and intermittent, the kind of smoke wet wood makes. As she watched, a figure emerged from the cabin, started digging through snow toward what had been their woodpile before the drifts buried it. It took him 20 minutes to reach the wood. She could see him clearly from this distance. Horace Bjornstad digging like his life depended on it, because it probably did, uncovering logs that had been soaked by 3 days of snow falling and melting and refreezing. He loaded his arms and trudged back, and even from 200 yards Ingrid could see the defeated slope of his shoulders. Lars stood beside her watching. "He's going to try to burn wet wood, isn't he?" "Yes, it won't work well." "No," Ingrid agreed. "It won't." They went back inside, and Ingrid fed the stove-dry pine from the gap space, and the cabin warmed to the point where the children could play in shirt sleeves, while outside the world tried to kill anything exposed to its attention for more than a few minutes. Christmas came without celebration, just another day in the long dark of deep winter. Ingrid made a special meal, venison stew with vegetables from their root-cellar cornbread, with the last of their honey-dried apple pie that made the cabin smell like remembered abundance. They sang songs, the children's voices carrying the simple melodies of hymns and folk tunes, and Ingrid felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief, thankful they were alive and warm, but mourning the husband and father who should have been there to see what they'd built. January 1874 arrived with temperatures that made December look temperate. -45 on January 3rd, -48 on January 7th. The cold was a presence, a malevolent entity that waited just beyond the walls, patient and implacable, ready to claim anyone foolish enough to expose themselves to its attention. Supply wagons couldn't get through. The trail from town, such as it was, had disappeared under snowdrifts that would take a crew of men days to clear, and no one was organizing a crew when survival required keeping your own fire fed and your own family protected. The homesteads became islands of isolation, each family alone with whatever supplies they'd managed to store, whatever firewood they'd cut, whatever luck or planning or desperate innovation could provide. Ingrid's family settled into winter routine. Wake breakfast lessons, lunch, more lessons or stories, early supper, evening time sleep. The gap space became their world's boundary cabin interior and firewood corridor, the only spaces they needed or could safely access. Outside was abstraction, a place that existed but might as well have been on another continent for all it affected their daily existence. Astrid's education advanced rapidly. She'd mastered long division and moved into basic geometry, understanding angles and ratios with the same intuitive grasp she'd shown for carpentry. Ingrid taught her double-entry bookkeeping, the kind of practical accounting that could make the difference between profit and loss for anyone running a farm or business. Lars developed his one-handed carpentry skills, learning to hold wood with his feet while planing it smooth to compensate for missing grip strength with better leverage and positioning. He built a wooden puzzle box with interlocking pieces that required specific manipulations to open, and Sigrid spent hours trying to solve it, her small fingers patient with trial and error. The isolation was broken only by sounds carried on the wind. Distant axe strikes as someone cut frozen wood. Occasional gunshots, whether hunting or signaling or something darker, Ingrid couldn't tell. Once, late at night in mid-January, a sound that might have been someone screaming, but the wind made verification impossible, and by morning there was nothing to see but more snow. On January 20th, new sounds emerged in the darkness beyond the barn walls. Howling, multiple voices, the hunting calls of wolves driven close to human habitation by hunger and desperation. The pack had come down from the north following deer herds that had migrated south seeking exposed grass and finding instead a landscape buried under snow where anything edible had either died or been claimed by humans. The howling came closer over the next few nights, and Ingrid understood what it meant. The wolves were testing, learning what was available, calculating risk versus reward. Most homesteaders kept livestock, a cow or chickens or pigs, animals that represented food stores and breeding stock and economic survival. Animals that were now potential prey for pack hunters experienced at killing things larger than themselves. She checked the barn doors, made sure the bar was secure, explained to the children that wolves were a threat they'd have to be aware of. Lars asked if wolves could break down doors, and Ingrid said probably not these doors, but they'd be careful anyway. The attack, when it came, wasn't on their barn. They heard it 2 nights later, distance muffled but unmistakable. Panicked, lowing from a cow, then the higher-pitched sounds of something dying badly, then silence except for the snarling and snapping of feeding predators. The sounds came from the direction of the Bjornstad place, and in the morning there was gunfire. Single shots spaced minutes apart, someone hunting wolves or mercy-killing wounded livestock. Lars listened to it all, his 9-year-old face serious. "They lost their cow, didn't they?" "Probably," Ingrid said. "Will they have enough food without it?" She wanted to lie, to offer reassurance that wasn't hers to give, but Lars deserved truth. "I don't know. Losing a milk cow in January is serious. They'll have to manage with what else they stored." February arrived, and with it came a shift in the quality of cold. Still brutal, still deadly, but with a different edge, as if winter had begun to consider the possibility of eventual retreat. The temperature moderated from the -40s to the -20s, which felt almost balmy by comparison, and the wind decreased from constant to merely frequent. But winter's moderation also meant instability, temperature swings that created icing conditions, snow that melted slightly during the day and froze harder at night, accumulating layers of ice that made surfaces treacherous and weight distributions unpredictable. Roofs that had held snow for months suddenly faced loads that shifted and compressed, creating stresses that could collapse timbers without warning. Ingrid checked the barn roof daily, looking for signs of dangerous accumulation areas where snow had drifted deep enough to threaten structural integrity. The design Gunnar had taught her with its steep slope and overhang shed most loads naturally, but she remained vigilant because vigilance was the price of survival. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, though nobody out here marked it with anything except awareness of the date, Ingrid woke at 11 p.m. to knocking on the barn door. Not the cabin door, the exterior barn door, someone outside in minus 42-degree cold knocking with what sounded like desperation. She lit a lamp and moved to the door, Lars beside her with the hunting rifle they kept loaded for emergencies. She called through the thick sod wall. "Who's there, Bjornstad?" The voice was hoarse, strained. "Please, Mrs. Thornquist, my daughter, she's dying. We need help." Ingrid lifted the bar and opened the door. Horace Bjornstad stood there with his 8-year-old daughter Karen in his arms, the child wrapped in blankets that couldn't hide the blue tinge to her lips. Mrs. Bjornstad stood behind them, shaking so hard from cold that she could barely stand. "Inside, quickly." Ingrid pulled them through the door into the gap space through the cabin door to the stove, where heat still radiated from coals. She took Karen from Bjornstad's arms and placed her directly in front of the stove's open door, began rubbing the child's extremities to restore circulation. "What happened?" She asked it while working her hands efficient with the kind of emergency competence that came from having navigated her own children's near deaths. Bjornstad's voice broke on the words. "Firewood ran out yesterday. Everything outside is buried or wet. We've been burning furniture, but it's not enough, and the stove went out 3 hours ago, and Karen, she just kept getting colder, and I didn't know what else to do." Mrs. Bjornstad was crying, silent tears running down cheeks that were still regaining color from their frostbite pallor. "We mocked you. I'm so sorry we mocked you, and you were right and we were wrong, and please don't let my baby die." Ingrid looked at this woman who'd borrowed yeast and wondered why anyone would go to such trouble for firewood, and felt something complicated in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite pity, something in between that tasted like vindication mixed with grief. "Astrid," she said, voice calm and commanding, "get dry wood from the gap space enough to fill a sack. Lars, heat water for tea. Sigrid, get the extra quilts from the chest." The children moved with practiced efficiency, and within minutes, Karen was wrapped in quilts in front of a roaring fire, drinking hot tea in small sips, color returning to her face in patches. Mrs. Bjornstad held her daughter and cried, and Horace Bjornstad stood looking at Ingrid with an expression that contained shame and gratitude in measures he couldn't begin to articulate. Ingrid filled a large canvas sack with split logs, half a cord at least wood she could spare because she'd planned for exactly this kind of contingency. She gave Bjornstad the sack and met his eyes directly. "This will get you through the next week. After that, you'll need to dig for your own wood and dry it as best you can. If your stove fails again," she paused, making sure he understood what she was saying, "come back. Don't let pride kill your family." "I was wrong." Bjornstad said, the words coming out rough and small. "You were right and I was wrong, and I'm sorry." "I don't need your apology," Ingrid said. "I just need you to remember what you learned tonight and next year prepare differently." They left an hour later when Karen could walk and the adults had warmed enough that exposure wouldn't kill them on the 200-yard journey home. Ingrid watched them disappear into the darkness, the sack of firewood on Bjornstad's shoulder, and then closed the barn door and went back inside where her children waited. Astrid's face held questions she was too young to ask and too smart not to think. "We gave them wood. Now we have less." "We have enough," Ingrid said, "and they were dying. That's what neighbors do, Elskling. We help each other survive, even when they laughed at us." Especially then, Ingrid said, thinking about how survival on the frontier required community, despite the isolation, required people helping each other despite disagreements or judgment, required a kind of grace that transcended individual grievance. Because teaching by example works better than teaching by revenge. The story spread through the settlement faster than winter wind. The Bjornstads told the McTavishes, who told the Lindgren's nephew who'd inherited their claim, who told the Norwegian family who'd homesteaded the section to the east. By the time March arrived and the first real thaw began, every family within 10 miles knew that Ingrid Thornquist had saved the Bjornstad child with dry firewood pulled from a barn built over her house, the same barn they'd all mocked for being strange and impractical and the confused product of a widow who didn't know any better. March brought temperature moderation and intermittent sun and the first hints that winter might eventually release its grip. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing a prairie that looked exhausted, beaten down by months of cold and weight. The homesteaders emerged from their isolation, checking on neighbors, counting casualties, taking stock of what had been lost and what had survived. The news was grim, but not unexpected. 2 families had died completely frozen in their cabins when their firewood ran out and wet wood proved insufficient. 3 families had lost children. 5 families had abandoned their claims midwinter, left notes and bodies, and rode or walked east hoping to reach civilization before the cold claimed them too. The settlement that had been 40 families in November was maybe 28 by March, and of those 28, several were seriously considering whether another winter was worth the gamble. But Ingrid's family had survived intact, healthy, with firewood to spare and supplies enough that they'd eaten well all winter. More than survived, they'd thrived in ways that seemed almost offensive given the surrounding devastation. The children had grown learned, developed skills and knowledge that would serve them forever. Ingrid herself felt stronger, more capable, more certain that she belonged on this land and could make it yield survival, if not yet prosperity. People came to see the barn cabin not with mockery now, but with genuine curiosity and something approaching humility. They walked through the gap space, saw the remaining firewood still stacked and organized, touched the sod walls that had held heat through months of -40 cold, asked questions about construction and design, and whether Ingrid would help them build something similar. She said yes to every request. Yes, she'd advise on design. Yes, she'd explain the principles. Yes, she'd loan tools and share measurements and teach what Gunnar had taught her. Because knowledge that stayed hoarded was knowledge wasted, and the frontier killed people stupid enough to think survival was a solo endeavor rather than a collaborative project that required everyone to get smarter together. Astrid became her assistant in these teaching sessions, this 12-year-old girl who could explain load-bearing calculations and insulation principles with the casual competence of someone 3 times her age. People listened to her because she made sense, because she could take complex ideas and reduce them to simple actions that anyone could follow. Lars showed families how to stack firewood for maximum air circulation, his 9 fingers moving with precision that made the absent half-pinky irrelevant. Sigrid, 7 now, and taller than seemed possible, sang the Norwegian songs her mother had taught her, providing entertainment and cultural connection to people starved for anything beyond survival's bare minimum. By the time April arrived and the prairie began to green properly, 7 families had committed to building barn cabins for the following winter. 3 others planned partial implementations, lean-to structures against existing cabins that would protect firewood without the full investment of time and materials. 2 families asked Ingrid to walk their claims and advise on optimal placement, on where to locate structures for best protection from prevailing winds, on how to read the land's subtle topography for signs of where snow would drift and where it would stay shallow. She did all of it, this woman who 16 months earlier had been told to go back east because a widow couldn't survive alone, and she did it with the same systematic competence she'd brought to building the structure that had saved her family. Observe the problem, understand its components, design a solution, execute the plan, adapt as needed. Simple principles, ruthlessly applied, proven effective by the basic fact of survival. One evening in late April, after the children were asleep and spring peepers were calling from the creek bottom, Ingrid stood outside the barn cabin and looked at what she'd built. The structure had weathered its first winter, proved its design sound, demonstrated that different didn't mean wrong, and unusual didn't mean impossible. The barn walls showed their age slightly, some settling in the sod, minor erosion at the base where spring runoff had tested the foundation, but nothing structural, nothing that threatened integrity. The roof had shed snow perfectly, the overhangs had protected the walls, the gap space had stayed dry and accessible exactly as designed. Every calculation had been proven correct, every risk had been justified, every hour of labor had yielded return measured in the basic currency of children sleeping warm through winter's worst assault. She thought about Gunnar somewhere out there helping another family or dead from the winter he'd ridden into with such calm acceptance of risk. She thought about Olaf, whose death had started this chain of events, whose firewood and carpentry and pragmatic approach to problems lived on in the structure and in the lessons she taught their children. She thought about next winter and the winter after that, and all the winters this building would shelter her family while accumulating the scratches and scars that proved it served its purpose. Somewhere to the south, wolves howled at the rising moon, their voices carrying across miles of thawing prairie predators calling to each other in the language of survival and hunger and the endless search for what would keep them alive another day. Ingrid listened to them without fear, standing beside her barn cabin with dry wood stacked inside and spring promising renewal, and thought about how teaching one person to survive made the whole community stronger, made the odds shift incrementally toward life rather than death, made the frontier slightly less lethal for everyone willing to observe and learn and adapt. The firewood had stayed dry all winter. The family had stayed warm, and the lesson had taken root in ways that would outlast any individual life, spreading from homestead to homestead, failure to success, mockery to vindication, until the frontier learned what she'd known since watching her children nearly freeze. That survival wasn't about fighting the land, it was about working with it, building what it needed you to build, storing what winter would demand, preparing when preparation was possible, so you had options when crisis arrived and preparation was too late. Spring 1874 revealed what winter had taken. The thaw came slowly, reluctant, and with it came the accounting. Bodies appeared as snow retreated, some in cabins where families had frozen together, some along trails where desperate journeys had ended in drifts that became graves. The McTavish family had lost 3 children total, now the third succumbing in late February when pneumonia and malnutrition combined forces. The 2 families who'd died completely were found in April. The Lindgren nephew, making the discovery and coming away from it, changed in ways that would mark him permanently. Pastor Nordheim organized burial details, men with shovels working ground still half frozen, digging graves in the small cemetery that was growing faster than anyone had anticipated when they'd marked it out 3 years earlier. The funerals were brief words insufficient against the scale of loss, and afterwards people gathered in small groups and talked in low voices about whether the prairie was worth this price. Ingrid attended every funeral, bringing her children because she wanted them to understand that survival wasn't guaranteed, that their warm winter had been purchased through planning and work, while others had died from lack of both. She stood at the gravesides and thought about how different choices led to different outcomes, how the margin between life and death could be measured in cords of dry wood, and the foresight to protect them from weather. The settlement's population had contracted from 40 families to 26. Some had died, some had left, and the ones remaining carried the weight of both categories. But among the survivors, something had shifted. The mockery was gone entirely, now replaced by a kind of desperate pragmatism. People wanted to know how to build what Ingrid had built, wanted to understand the principles that had kept her family comfortable while their own families had suffered. She started teaching in earnest in late April. Families came to the barn cabin, walked the gap space, asked questions about construction and design and materials. Ingrid answered everything patiently, sketching diagrams in dirt, explaining load calculations and insulation principles, making sure people understood not just what to do, but why it worked. Astrid became essential to these sessions. At 12, she could explain technical concepts more clearly than her mother, sometimes breaking complex ideas into simple steps that made sense even to people who'd never built anything more sophisticated than a lean-to. She'd stand beside a sod wall and run through the physics of thermal mass, how thick earth walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, creating temperature stability that thin wood walls could never match. Lars demonstrated firewood stacking techniques, his 9-fingered hands arranging split logs in patterns that maximized airflow and minimized rot. He'd lost the shyness that had marked him as a younger child, gained confidence from having skills people valued, and Ingrid watched him teach grown men about wood storage with a quiet pride that didn't need expression. The McTavish family was the first to commit to building. Ian McTavish, who'd buried 3 children in 2 years, approached Ingrid in early May with a request that carried the weight of desperation barely contained. "Help me build one. I can't lose another child." Ingrid spent 3 days walking his claim, studying wind patterns and snow accumulation areas, identifying the optimal location for a barn cabin that would protect his existing structure and provide the storage capacity he needed. She sketched plans, calculated materials, worked with him to determine what he could afford and what he could build with available resources. The construction became a community project. 6 families contributed labor, working in rotation, men cutting sod while women hauled it, children helping with smaller tasks that accumulated into progress. Ingrid supervised teaching as she went, making sure people understood each step so they could replicate it on their own claims. By late June, the McTavish barn cabin stood complete, smaller than Ingrid's, but built on the same principles. The same 6-foot gap between cabin and barn walls, the same sod construction and sloped roof. Ian McTavish walked through the gap space with his wife, both of them touching walls like they were sacred objects. And when he tried to thank Ingrid, his voice broke halfway through and he just shook his head, unable to find words that matched what he felt. "You'll thank me by surviving next winter," Ingrid said, "and by teaching someone else when they need it." The pattern repeated through summer. The Bjornstad family built a partial implementation, a lean-to structure on 3 sides of their cabin that protected their woodpile and created some insulation without the full investment of a complete barn. The Norwegian family to the east built a full barn cabin, working with the intensity of people who'd experienced winter's worst and refused to endure it again. Ingrid advised on all of it, traveling between homesteads, checking construction, correcting mistakes before they became structural problems. Astrid accompanied her on most trips, absorbing knowledge faster than Ingrid could teach it, asking questions that demonstrated understanding beyond her years. Summer brought its own challenges. Drought hit in July, the kind that made prairie grass brittle and brown, that lowered creek levels and made water scarce. Some families' wells went dry, forcing them to haul water from the creek or beg from neighbors with deeper wells. Ingrid's well held because Olaf had dug it deep. Understanding that prairie water tables fluctuated wildly and shallow wells were temporary solutions at best, she shared water with families who needed it, measuring out what she could spare, teaching them about well construction and water conservation, adding hydrology to the list of practical knowledge she was accumulating and distributing. The frontier was a harsh teacher, but it taught lessons worth learning if you survived the education. August brought grasshoppers in clouds that darkened the sun, insects that devoured everything green in their path, leaving behind devastation that looked biblical in scale. The swarm hit on August 12th and stayed for 3 days, eating crops and grass and garden vegetables, chewing through anything vegetable, including wooden tool handles and cotton clothes left on lines. Ingrid's family lost their garden completely, months of work reduced to bare stems and chewed leaves, but they had stored food from previous years, had canned vegetables and dried meat and grain put aside against exactly this kind of disaster. Other families weren't so fortunate. The Bjornstads lost everything their garden destroyed and their grain stores contaminated when grasshoppers found their way into the storage barrels. The sharing went both ways. Ingrid gave the Bjornstads enough food to get through until harvest, and in return, Horace Bjornstad helped her reinforce the barn roof where one section had shown slight sagging. No currency exchanged hands because currency was scarce, and barter was the economy that actually functioned. Labor for food, knowledge for materials, community for survival. By September 7, families had completed barn cabins or substantial protective structures. The settlement looked different from a distance now, the low sod buildings less visible than traditional cabins, but somehow more permanent, more integrated with the landscape, as if people were learning to build with the prairie rather than despite it. Fall brought preparation for the second test. Families that had suffered through the previous winter began gathering firewood in August, 3 months earlier than conventional wisdom suggested, driven by memory of wet wood and buried piles and children who'd stopped breathing in the cold. Ingrid watched this with satisfaction that felt complicated, glad they were learning, but grieving that the lesson had cost so many lives. Her own family cut 6 cords again, maintaining the margin that had saved them. And this year the work went faster because Lars and Astrid were stronger and more skilled. Even Sigrid, 7 now, and wiry with the kind of resilient toughness prairie children developed, could handle real work, splitting kindling and bundling it efficiently. The gap space filled again through September and October, corridors of stacked timber that represented insurance against cold and proof that last year hadn't been luck. Ingrid walked through it, sometimes touching the wood, remembering January nights when this supply had meant the difference between warmth and hypothermia, and thinking about the next January and all the Januaries that would follow. October brought a widower named Jacob Anderson to her door. He'd lost his wife to fever in August, was raising 2 sons alone, and needed help understanding how to manage a homestead without the partner who'd handled half the labor. He came asking about barn construction, but stayed talking about grief and loneliness and the specific challenges of single parenting on the frontier. Ingrid listened because she understood, had lived. It knew the weight of going to bed alone while children slept and wondering if you had the strength for another day of being both parents simultaneously. They talked through an afternoon, sharing experiences and strategies, and when Jacob left, he looked slightly less crushed than when he'd arrived. He returned 2 weeks later with a proposal that was practical rather than romantic. "I need help with my claim, and you've demonstrated you can manage yours. Perhaps we could combine resources, share labor, help each other survive." Ingrid considered it carefully. Marriage for convenience rather than love, partnership for survival rather than romance. It violated every notion of how these things were supposed to work, but the prairie had already violated every rule she'd brought from Minnesota, had taught her that survival required adaptation over tradition. "I'll think about it," she said, and meant it. Winter, 1874–75, arrived earlier than the previous year, snow falling in late October and staying. The temperature dropped quickly, skipping the gradual descent and plunging straight into serious cold by early November. The homesteaders watched this with anxiety, tempered by preparation, and those who'd built protective structures watched with something approaching confidence. Ingrid's barn cabin performed exactly as designed. The gap space stayed above. Freezing, the firewood stayed dry. The cabin interior remained comfortable even when outside temperatures dropped to -35, and wind created drifts that buried fences and threatened roof lines. The children continued their education, continued their play, continued growing in the protected environment their mother had built. But this winter brought new challenges. The wolf pack returned larger this year, emboldened by successful hunting the previous season. They prowled the settlement's perimeter, testing defenses, looking for weakness. Most homesteaders had learned from last year's livestock losses, had built better enclosures, and kept animals closer to human habitation. But wolves were patient and clever and hungry enough to take risks. The first attack came in mid-December, hitting the Norwegian family's chicken coop at night, killing a dozen birds before the farmer's gunfire drove them off. The second attack was the McTavish Place wolves circling their barn until sustained shooting sent them retreating into darkness. The third attempt targeted Bjornstad's rebuilt livestock shelter, but Horace had reinforced the structure and slept with his rifle, and the wolves found nothing worth the risk. They came to Ingrid's barn cabin on December 28th, a pack of 7 or 8 moving with the coordinated intelligence of social predators who'd learned to hunt as a unit. They circled the structure, testing the doors, scratching at walls, looking for entry points that would give them access to any animals inside. But Ingrid kept no livestock in the barn. The gap space held only firewood and supplies. Nothing edible from a wolf's perspective, and the sod walls were too thick to dig through and the doors too solid to force. Lars stood at the window with the rifle, watching them circle, understanding that killing one might drive them off, but also might bring the whole pack down in retaliation. "Don't shoot unless they break through," Ingrid said. "They'll leave when they realize there's nothing for them here." The wolves stayed an hour, howling occasionally, circling, testing. Then they moved off toward the creek bottom where deer sometimes sheltered, and the night returned to the ordinary sounds of wind and cold. In the morning, tracks in the snow told the story of their visit, and Ingrid studied them the way she studied everything, looking for patterns and behaviors that might inform future decisions. Wolves were part of the prairie ecosystem, had as much right to survival as humans, but where their interests conflicted with human safety, choices had to be made. The settlement organized hunting parties in January, men tracking the pack through snow, trying to reduce their numbers enough to push them back north, where prey was more abundant and human interaction less frequent. Jacob Anderson led one party demonstrating the kind of practical competence that had kept him alive through multiple frontier winters, and they brought back 3 wolf pelts that became winter clothing for children who needed warmer layers. February 1875 brought temperatures that exceeded the previous winter's cold days, when the thermometer showed -48, -50 numbers that made survival feel like an active miracle rather than a passive outcome. But the families with barn cabins or protective structures weathered it without the casualties that had marked the previous year. The firewood stayed dry, the buildings held heat, and children stayed alive. Other families weren't so fortunate. The drought and grasshoppers had depleted food stores, and some homesteaders found themselves choosing between burning wood for heat and burning it for cooking, between staying warm and eating hot food. The McTavish families survived on cold meals for 2 weeks in February, keeping their fire minimal to conserve wood, and when Ingrid heard about it, she brought them food that could be eaten without cooking and an armload of firewood she could spare. "You helped us build the barn," Ian McTavish said, his voice carrying shame at needing more help. "And now you're feeding us too." "I don't know how to repay this." "Survive," Ingrid said simply. "Teach your children what you've learned. Pass the knowledge forward. That's the repayment." Spring arrived in March with the kind of tentative warmth that could reverse into cold without warning, but by April the thaw was genuine, and the prairie began greening, and the settlers emerged to count their survival. This winter had been colder but less deadly, the improved structures and earlier preparations saving families that might otherwise have joined the cemetery's growing population. The settlement had lost 3 people total, all elderly or chronically ill deaths that would have happened regardless of winter's severity. No children had frozen, no families had been wiped out by firewood failure, no mass exodus had occurred because people had stayed warm enough to imagine enduring another cycle. Jacob Anderson proposed again in April, more formally this time, and Ingrid accepted. Not because she loved him, though affection might develop given time, but because partnership made practical sense, and because his 2 sons needed a mother's presence, and because combining homesteads would create a larger, more resilient operation. They married in May, a simple ceremony with Pastor Nordheim officiating and the whole settlement attending, because weddings were rare enough to be community celebrations. Astrid, Lars, and Sigrid gained 2 stepbrothers' boys, who were rough around the edges but decent at core, and the combined family began learning to function as a unit. The barn cabin expanded that summer, Ingrid and Jacob adding a wing that created space for livestock, properly integrating animals into the thermal design the way Scandinavian farmers had done for centuries. The addition followed the same principles: sod walls and protected storage and careful attention to airflow and temperature management. Years accumulated after that, winter survived, and crops harvested, and children growing into the kind of frontier competence that would serve them whether they stayed or left. Astrid developed into a builder of genuine skill, advised on construction projects across the territory, became known as someone who understood structural engineering without ever calling it that. She married at 18, moved to a neighboring claim, built her own barn cabin with the knowledge her mother had given her. Lars became a carpenter, his 9 fingers producing work that was as precise as anything 10 fingers could achieve, specializing in furniture and cabinets and the kind of fine woodworking that transformed functional objects into beautiful ones. His missing digit became his signature, the mark of someone who'd survived childhood on the Dakota frontier and carried the scars to prove it. Sigrid discovered music, her memory for songs expanding into an ability to play instruments by ear, to compose simple melodies that carried the prairie's loneliness and beauty in equal measure. She eventually moved east, married a piano teacher, lived a life that was easier and softer than anything the frontier offered, but she carried Dakota with her in the songs she taught her students. The barn cabin stood through it all, weathering winters and summers, the sod walls settling and compressing but never failing the roof. Shedding snow season after season, the gap space holding firewood for families that grew and changed and eventually dispersed. Ingrid and Jacob raised their combined family there, added a 3rd wing in the 1880s when their economic situation improved, converted the original cabin into storage when they built a larger house within the barn's protective envelope. The structure became a landmark, The Thornquist Place, people called it, even after Jakob's name joined Ingrid's on the property deed. Travelers used it for navigation, the distinctive low profile and careful construction marking a point on the prairie that meant civilization and safety and someone who understood how to survive. Ingrid watched her children leave, watched grandchildren arrive and grow, watched the settlement transform from desperate homesteaders to established community with a church and school and general store. The prairie had been broken, plowed under, converted from grassland to farmland, and whether that was progress or tragedy depended on who you asked and what you valued. She died in 1903, 70 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren, her body worn out from decades of frontier labor, but her mind sharp until the end. They buried her beside Olaf and Henrik, the two husbands who'd given her different kinds of partnership, and the settlement shut down for the funeral because everyone owed her something, knowledge or food, or the example of how to endure when endurance seemed impossible. Jakob followed her 3 years later, and after that the barn cabin passed to Astrid, who by then had her own grown children, and a life that didn't include living in the structure she'd helped build as a girl. She kept it maintained, used it for storage, visited occasionally to walk through the gap space, and remember winters when survival had seemed uncertain and firewood had meant everything. The structure stood empty by 1914, still solid, but no longer inhabited, a memorial to a particular moment in frontier history when innovation had meant the difference between life and death. The settlement had grown into a small town, had modern amenities like railroad access, and telephone lines had moved beyond the desperate years when wet wood and buried wood piles could kill you. In spring 1916, Astrid returned to the barn cabin with her own children and grandchildren, making a pilgrimage to the place where she'd learned what mattered. She was 54 now. Lars was 51, Sigrid 48, all of them marked by time but still carrying the frontier's stamp in their faces and hands and the way they moved through the world. They walked through the structure together, 3 generations, grandchildren asking questions about what it had been like, children explaining the history, Astrid and her siblings remembering details that brought the past into sharp focus. The gap space was empty of firewood now, just open corridor, and the ghosts of stacked cords that had saved them. A granddaughter, maybe 10 years old, touched the sod wall and looked at Astrid with serious eyes. Great-grandmother Ingrid must have been very smart to build this. Astrid thought about how to answer about what lessons mattered enough to pass down through generations, about what her mother would have wanted understood. She was smart, yes. But more than that, she knew how to observe, how to learn from what she saw, how to adapt when circumstances demanded it. She didn't fight the prairie. She learned to work with it. The girl processed this, her face showing the kind of deep thought children bring to concepts they almost understand. Why did people laugh at her? Because people are afraid of things that are different, Lars said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been mocked for different reasons. They thought your great-grandmother was wrong because she wasn't doing things the traditional way. But tradition kills you when conditions change. They stood in the gap space, sun filtering through cracks in the barn walls, dust motes floating in the light, and Astrid felt time collapse into a single moment where past and present occupied the same space. She could almost see her mother standing here, 12-year-old Astrid beside her, both of them stacking firewood in October 1873, while neighbors mocked them for wasting effort. "Did you know it would work?" one of Sigrid's grandchildren asked. "When you were building it, did you know you'd survive?" Astrid smiled at the question's innocence, at the assumption that knowledge and confidence were the same thing. "We hoped it would work. We believed the design made sense. But we didn't know, not with certainty. We just did the best we could with what we understood, and we got lucky that our best was good enough." "That's not luck," Lars said quietly. "That's preparation meeting opportunity. Mama taught us that. She prepared when preparation was possible, so we had options when crisis arrived and preparation was too late." The words hung in the dusty air, and Astrid recognized them as something worth preserving, worth carrying forward into whatever futures her grandchildren would face. Not just about firewood and sod walls, but about how to approach any challenge, any uncertainty, any situation where the old ways weren't working and new thinking required courage. What happened to the structure after this? The 10-year-old again wanting the story's ending. We kept it another year, Astrid said. Then the family moved to town and it wasn't needed anymore. But what it taught us, what it represented, that lasted longer than the building itself. They walked outside into spring sunshine, the prairie stretching in all directions, broken now by farms and fences and roads domesticated in ways it hadn't been when Ingrid first arrived. The barn cabin would be abandoned officially by year's end, the sod walls left to erode slowly back into the earth that had made them, the roof timbers salvaged for other projects, the space returning to prairie grass. But standing there with her children and grandchildren, Astrid felt the presence of what her mother had built, extending beyond physical structure into the realm of principle and practice. Every barn cabin in the territory, every protected woodpile, every settler who'd learned to plan for winter and summer, every family that had survived because someone taught them a better way. All of it traced back to one widow who'd refused to accept that the conventional approach was the only approach. The prairie wind picked up, carrying the smell of new grass and distant rain, and one of Lars's grandchildren asked if they could go inside one more time just to see it again before it was gone forever. They went back in the whole extended family and stood in the gap space where firewood had been stacked for 43 winters, where survival had been measured in cords and access and the simple miracle of dry wood in deep cold. Astrid spoke to the gathering, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived the history she was recounting. Your great-great-grandmother Ingrid taught me something I want to pass to you. She taught me that survival isn't about being the strongest or the bravest. It's about being the most observant, the most willing to learn, the most ready to do things differently when the old ways are killing people. She gestured at the sod walls, the roof structure, the design that had once seemed crazy and was now recognized as brilliant. People laughed at her when she built this. They called it the widow's folly, said she was wasting time, and materials said grief had broken her judgment. But she kept building because she'd observed a problem and designed a solution, and she trusted her observations more than other people's opinions. What's the lesson? Sigrid's daughter asked, 16 and sharp enough to know there was always a lesson. The lesson is that when winter comes, and winter always comes in one form or another, you want to be the one who prepared when preparation was possible. Astrid looked at each grandchild in turn, making sure they understood she was speaking to them specifically. You want to be the one who observed the problem, understood its components, designed a solution, and executed it before crisis arrived. They filed out slowly, children running ahead, adults lingering, the afternoon sun turning the prairie gold in that particular way it did in late spring. Astrid was the last to leave, pulling the barn door closed behind her, and as she walked away she thought about all the winters the structure had weathered, all the mornings her mother had opened the cabin door and stepped into the gap space and selected dry wood while other families dug through snow for frozen logs. In all those years, through every blizzard that came howling down from Canada with temperatures that could kill in minutes, through every desperate February and brutal January, through every winter that tested whether human ingenuity could overcome environmental hostility, the firewood had stayed dry. The family had stayed warm, and the principle had proven true that observation plus adaptation plus preparation equals survival, that working with nature instead of against it changes the odds, that building what the situation needs rather than what tradition demands can mean the difference between life and death. The barn cabin would collapse eventually, sod walls eroding roof timbers, rotting the whole structure, returning to the earth that had provided its materials. But the knowledge would persist, passed person to person, generation to generation, spreading outward from this point on the Dakota prairie where one widow had looked at a problem and refused to accept that the conventional solution was sufficient. Astrid walked toward her automobile, this machine that represented progress and change and the transformation of frontier into civilization, and thought about what endured and what was lost when things changed. The frontier was gone, the desperate years over the specific challenges that had required barn cabins solved by modern heating and insulation and supply chains that didn't break down every winter. But the principle remained, would always remain, because human nature and environmental challenge were constants even when specific circumstances shifted. Observe the details that matter most, Ingrid had taught her children. Stay dry, stay warm, keep your resources accessible. Build with the environment instead of against it. Learn from those who survived what you're facing. Be willing to do things differently when tradition isn't working. Prepare when preparation is possible. The automobile started with the coughing rattle of early engines, and Astrid drove away from the barn cabin with 3 generations of family crowded into the vehicle, leaving behind the structure but carrying forward the lessons. And somewhere in that exchange was the real inheritance, the part that mattered more than land or money or anything that could be physically grasped. Winter would come again, different winters facing different challenges, but winter always came in the end. The question was always the same. Would you be ready when it arrived? Or would you be the one burning furniture while your children shivered, digging for wet wood while dry wood was possible, fighting the land instead of learning from it? The prairie stretched behind them, grass rippling in wind that had blown since long before humans arrived and would blow long after they were gone, and built into that landscape was a lesson about survival that transcended firewood and sod walls. The lesson that preparation saves lives, that observation yields knowledge, that adaptation beats tradition when conditions demand it, that the people who survive aren't always the strongest or richest or most confident, but the ones who learn to read the signs and plan accordingly and build what winter required before winter arrived to test whether their building was adequate. 43 years, the structure had stood sheltering 3 generations through some of the harshest winters the Dakota Territory ever recorded. And in all those years, measured against all those challenges, tested by every blizzard and cold snap and desperate February morning, one truth had remained constant, proven again and again by the simple fact of survival. The firewood stayed dry and the family stayed warm, and the lesson endured beyond the building that taught it.